Voice is the expression of your aliveness. So when someone criticizes your voice, they are criticizing that expression of your aliveness. But what I would say to someone who feels criticized is that you can hone that expression. So when someone criticizes you, it's not identity, it's practice, it's habit.
Hi, I'm James Taylor, business creativity and innovation keynote speaker, and this is The Creative Life, a show dedicated to you, the creative. If you're looking for motivation, inspiration, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's an author, musician, entrepreneur, performer, designer, or thought leader. They'll share with you their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, and much, much more. You'll find show notes for this episode, as well as free training on creativity, over at jamestaylor.me. Enjoy this episode. Hi there, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to have on the show Caroline Goyder. Caroline is a leading voice and speaker coach. For a decade, she worked at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, a leading drama school in London. Author of Find Your Voice, Gravitas, and Star Qualities, Caroline's TEDX on the surprising secret to speaking with confidence has been watched 7.5 million times. Amazing. And it's my great pleasure to have Caroline with us today. So welcome, Caroline.
It's a great pleasure to be here, James. Thank you for having me.
So share with us all what's happening in your life, in your world just now.
Well, like everybody, I am in the midst of the COVID turbulence. But what that's meant is I've had lots more time to think about this new book and to kind of get it out there in the world, and also to start creating more digital product, which is actually quite fun because I'm an introvert. So it's quite nice to go away and cook stuff up, you know, in the privacy of your own office. I'm secretly quite enjoying COVID. I know it's been terrible for many people and I wouldn't want to be on the front line, but the peace for introverts is rather lovely.
And I think often I see a lot of singers I know, and also some speakers, they're perfectly adjusted to this time of social distancing and washing your hands and being very conscious about people with coughs and colds and things, because you've been doing it. You're always kind of on the lookout for some of these things.
Paranoid, one could say.
So how, because one of the things that I haven't really seen it being talked about too much, but you're hearing about now the ongoing problems of people after they've had COVID or they get it, they have problems with their voice because it attacks the breathing.
It's so interesting because poor old Boris Johnson, I was watching him, doing his speech last night, and you can hear in his voice that his lungs are only partially back to work vocally for him. And so, he's just one example. I can really hear that it affects people. And it just goes on to show how important the voice is and how when we're affected by illness, that massively affects our presence.
And then obviously then you can almost notice in some of these people how it affects their confidence as well, which is the kind of the linkage that you have between this voice and being the kind of the seat of confidence that so many people have.
Yes, and that's the loop, isn't it? And I suppose what an actor would say about that. I once interviewed Bill Nye, who was marvelous, for my first book. And he said, if you're ill as an actor on stage, you just have to own the illness. You have to make it part of you. Because if you try and fight something like that, you spend quite a lot of time in the fight. And the more you can just accept that this is and work with it, the more likely you are to have presence even when ill. And so that's a note that I would say to Boris Johnson. Don't fight it. Don't try and be the person you were a month ago. Show up as the person you are now with the limitations that you've got, and use, it's what Michael Caine calls using the difficulty, which is a brilliant way to put it.
Now, something else I've heard Michael Caine, you talk a lot about this, but Michael Caine, I've seen him talk about this before, is I think he said that the practice is the work, the acting is the play, or something on basically saying all the work has to go into the practice section. So when you are up on stage, whether you're speaking or singing, you're really able to kind of let fly and really kind of go wherever you kind of want to go, wherever your imagination wants to take you.
That's exactly it. And I think people make the mistake of seeing a speaker who is, in inverted commas, natural, and forgetting all the work that goes into being natural like that. Hours of thinking about your breath, your posture, your voice, your power, and all of, and so what I would say to anybody who wanted to work on their voice, on their presence, is just find a discipline that supports you, and then your voice will get better. And when you speak on stage or on Zoom, you'll show up differently.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned in your excellent kind of TED talk, 7.5 million. I mean, could you ever have imagined it would have that many views?
No. If I'd known that when I stepped out, I would have been utterly terrified.
And one of the things that you mentioned on it, and I was, as I was watching it earlier today, and I was thinking about the time that we're in at the moment, you talked about, you call him the Greek dude. Yeah. The Greek dude, he kind of went into a kind of self-imposed exile, I guess, yes. Self-imposed self-isolation as well, in order to do something. And I actually thought, well, maybe there's a lesson to take from this, not just about our voice, but actually how we use this time. So for people that don't know the story of the Greek dude, as you call him, tell us that story and how it kind of it relates to someone that's doing any type of speaking, singing, or any type of creative work for that matter.
Yeah, so Demosthenes, who anybody who knows about voice and speech has probably come across the name Demosthenes, because he's the poster boy for a growth mindset around voice and speech, because he was originally booed out of the assembly for making a terrible speech. And someone came up to him, and, an old chap came up to him at the end when he was feeling very despondent and said, here are a few things you can work on. And he went away and he locked himself in his house and he shaved his head so that he couldn't go out, although probably most people are shaving their heads and not going out at the moment. And he worked on his speech. He ran up hills. He spoke in a polished shield. He put a pebble in his mouth to practice his articulation. Don't try this at home. And he came out, he went back to the assembly, and he became known as one of the greatest speakers of his generation. So he is the poster boy for learning to speak well. And he exemplifies the idea that we can all learn to do it, even from a shaky start.
Now, something I've heard from a number of different speakers, and just different people performers are having to make the transition from performing on a stage as now having to perform on Zoom or some other virtual means as well, is first of all, they're having to kind of go from a big stage, a big canvas in which to paint on, to what feels like a much smaller canvas. But something I feel that's been spoken about less is what that is doing to our voices. When you think of that someone that's on stage, projecting to the back of the room, and you're thinking about Zoom or any type of virtual, what is that doing? What advice would you give for those speakers, those performers that are out there just now that are suddenly having to go into this much smaller space?
It's so interesting, isn't it? And I think I've been thinking about this a lot. And the closest I can come to is that when you work with actors, they do their training for stage and then they do their training for screen. And the thing that good sound editors, good sound people will always say to you is, even if you're on screen and the person is really close to you, don't go off your voice, don't de-voice, don't lose the power. And I think all of that's true for Zoom. I think it's very easy to trained performers probably would do this less. But what I see a lot is people kind of hunching over a laptop rather than lifting it up. So the first thing I would say to someone is, get your screen on 2 thick books, 2 copies of old Spotlight editions if you're an actor, or thick, dictionaries, so that your screen is up. Sit up, and then, just as you know how to do in performance, always think of sending your voice to the back wall, or even sending your voice to a tree on the horizon. Not so that you're kind of filling Carnegie Hall, but just so that your voice is allowed to travel and you're allowed to fill space. And that, A, it connects you to all the muscles, all the good habits that you know professionally, and B, it ups your energy. And what screen actors will tell you is the camera requires a little bit more energy. So give out the right level of energy, and energy will come back to you on Zoom in a strange way, but it will. It's different to real life, but it doesn't have to be worse.
But that's interesting. You're kind of talking about those differences there. You mentioned Michael Caine earlier. There was that amazing masterclass I think it was still on YouTube now, where he talked about the difference between acting to camera as opposed to acting on stage, and how you use your kind of body differently. I'm just thinking that,
you mentioned that idea of power. You speak in the TEDx video. You talked about the role of the breath and diaphragm, and knowing, being able to feel your diaphragm and how the diaphragm moves as well. Surely Zoom must be true, or doing any type of thing where you're kind of sitting down. That must be truly terrible for the diaphragm, and be very easy to bring in some bad habits there.
Oh, so much. Do you know what? I have just bought, because I've got some webinars. We were talking about webinars before this call. Because I've got some webinars to do, I've bought on a good online retailer whose name I shall not name, a stand-up laptop, a laptop stand, like a music stand. Because I'm really conscious of that very fact that when I sit, I don't have the natural alignment. I don't have the space for my diaphragm to move in my rib cage. My shoulders tend to slump, my jaw gets tighter. So I'm going to stand up and do these webinars. And I would really invite people to A, get their laptop up, propped up on those big, thick books, and B, if you can stand up, do, because it's going to really help your voice, and you'll have more energy at the end of the day as well.
Yeah, something pretty much most webinars I know I do, I always have to stand, and I just find the energy feels so much smaller when you're sitting. I think you can have a more intimate sometimes a conversation when you're kind of seated like we do normally, but when you're standing, you're sitting, the camera requires more energy, having to kind of project like that. For me, I've got to stand. I've got to have some movement there as well.
Exactly. And I just think it's having permission to do that, because we're confused at the moment about talking to these laptop screens, which we've always done in quite an intimate way. And suddenly we're on stage. It's like it's the equivalent of a conference stage. So you've got to step up to that and own that in the right way. And standing up is a really good way to start.
Now, in your talks before, I know you write this about this in your books as well. Something happened to you, a time when you can argue you had a failure of your life as a speaker, as a performer, someone that's kind of used to using their voice on a stage. Can you recount that story, and more importantly, what was the lesson that you took away from that?
Oh gosh, I mean, it was an example. I was invited to speak at a conference which I was slightly daunted by, classic imposter syndrome, and I let someone else tell me how much rehearsal I needed, which any performer knows is fatal. And I rocked up on that stage in front of a huge audience in a really big space, unrehearsed, unsure of what was going to happen in this duo, very dangerous. And then the tech failed. And at the end of that, I remember walking out of the conference hall just feeling utterly ashamed and kind of not even knowing if I would ever get back on a stage again. But in the end, it was, as so often is, when you mess up big time, a massive lesson in taking control, in taking creative control, and making sure that you put the work in and not being daunted. And now when I hit imposter syndrome, I really step up to it. I do the work rather than hiding away, digging my head into the sand, which is what I did then.
So you mentioned like this idea of imposter syndrome when let's say when a guitar player goes up, it's on a stage, it's easier. I always feel it's easier for them to kind of fake it because they have this thing between themselves and the audience and the ears of the audience. But with a speaker or a singer, you are your instrument. And it almost feels like when someone criticizes you as a speaker or a singer, it's like they're not criticizing the craft or a particular technique. They're almost like they're criticizing you. It's you they're talking about.
Voice is the expression of your aliveness. So when someone criticizes your voice, they are criticizing that expression of your aliveness. But what I would say to someone who feels criticized is that you can hone that expression. So when someone criticizes you, it's not identity, it's practice, it's habit. Very Michael Caine.
Very Michael Caine. And what about when you come from the world of, not understanding about musical theatre, we were talking about this kind of just beforehand about the musical theatre voice, opera voice, jazz voices as well. It must be very easy for someone that's kind of coming into it to have to kind of lose any authenticity about their voice and just end up sounding like another Adele or Julie Andrews or whoever the person maybe. As you're kind of developing your voice, any tips that you'd have for how to ensure that you keep something that's truthful, something that's honest, something that's you within that voice and not get too knocked about?
Such an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think with actors, that's something that comes, if I think of, in the old days when I was training actors at Central, younger actors have to learn that, I think, in the business. And in my first book, I talked to actors about confidence, and it was interesting hearing people like Rufus Sewell and Ewan McGregor and Kate Winslet and, pretty seasoned actors talking about how they had found their own voices and learned to be true to their own instincts and learned to listen to their inner sense of what is working. But I think for performers, it's a really hard balance, isn't it? Because you have to be able to take a note at the same time. So I think performers in a way and creatives in a way that's different to people in kind of corporate life are constantly balancing what's my instinct here and how do I mediate that through the person that's directing me or giving me notes. And that, when people find that balance, is when they fly.
So how did you personally find that? Was it something that was very kinesthetic? It was a kind of feeling that you just said, this is me? Or was it something more a head type of thing? You felt like a slightly more almost like theoretical way, or a way you kind of had to think it through in order to kind of find that?
God, it's interesting, isn't it? I think that so when I went to drama school and I got some really tough, almost brutal feedback in the way that drama school was back in the day. And I fought it and I resisted it and I was angry and emotional about it. And I think the lesson that I've learned in my old age is that when you get a really tough piece of feedback, and I learned this from those actors I talked to, I think, let it in, breathe it, give it permission for a moment, let it sit with you. If there's some truth in it, take that truth and work with it, but reject anything that doesn't feel right. Now, in my first book, which was ironically the one about the actors and confidence, I took on so much feedback that I lost the heart of the book. And in my subsequent books, rather, my second and third books, I took the feedback, which was sometimes really tough. I sat with it and I made it mine. And I think when we learn to do that is when interesting things start to happen, because you do need creative tension, but you have to be able to sit with it and not fight it. Alexander technique is something I think really helps actually with that, which sounds crazy, but I think when you work with a good Alexander teacher, they help you to find more ease and more safety physically. And I think mentally, for me, that allows me to be more open to feedback, that mind-body link.
And you work with a lot of executives, helping them find the confidence in their voice to be able to present, not necessarily to go up on stage and sing, but to present their ideas. I'd imagine many of the people you work with, they're very senior executives, and maybe she hasn't had a lot of she's not kind of used to taking direction in that same way. She's used to being the boss.
Yes.
So how do you help those kind of people understand about directing, being directable?
Well, I think as a coach in that zone, the thing that allows you to do that work is to know when you have permission. And so I spend a lot of my time in those situations, being open, being present, listening. And then it's knowing when to make the intervention, when to give the note, and how to give it in a way that allows someone to feel safe enough to grow, but not so unsafe that they just resist. And I think that sometimes when I'm coaching someone like that, I say something really that sounds really simple on the surface, but it's knowing when you have permission to say that, and knowing if you have 5 minutes to give someone feedback, what's the thing that you should say? And I think that's the art that I've developed over the last few years, mainly through my own practice, because you have to have tried it in your own body to be able to pass it on to someone else, as any performer knows.
Because in the media, we don't really have a lot of good examples. I mean, I think of a lot of those talent shows that fill up the airwaves, the Simon Cowells, the the kind of Dragon's Den, the Apprentice style shows, and there's not a lot of psychological safety.
No,
in many of
that's
those.
not what telly wants, is it?
Exactly. It makes for very good
opposite.
drama, but maybe not so such good coaching. In your own journey, your own kind of creative life and journey, was there a key insight or light bulb moment when you decided you wanted to go in a particular direction with your creative work?
Gosh, I was a very frustrated drama teacher, teaching in South London, not happy. And it's funny, I had jury service in London, and I had 2 weeks jury service, and every day I crossed the river, walked past the Globe, walked across the bridges, and I watched all these people who looked so happy and they looked so excited about going to work. And I thought, I want an environment that allows me to feel excited to go to work. And that was the point that I went and trained as an actor. And I found myself in the midst of a very tricky discipline that I wasn't a natural at. But what I loved was the fact that through practice, through learning the discipline, you could get better. And I think that what they said to me at drama school is, you have no discipline. And what it taught me was that if you create a set of good habits, you can get better so fast. And I've been hooked on that ever since. The power of discipline to change you.
Now, in the work that you do today, I know there's a lot of apps out there for people on their voice. I know there's a lot of apps out for kind of singers and different things. What do you think? Are there any kind of actual mobile apps you actually find useful for the work that you do?
There's a really great app by a yoga teacher called Max Strom, Strom, and it's called Strategic Breathing. And the reason I love it is it's physiologically sound. What he's teaching is good. He knows his stuff. But I'm also always listening to voices, and he's got a really great voice, which tells you, of course, that his breathing is centered. And there's so much about the quality of someone's voice when they're teaching you this stuff. So that's the one I recommend all the time.
Max Strom, Strategic Breathing. We'll put all on the show links here as well. And what about if you were to recommend one book and also one album, one record to our listeners? What would those be?
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, the book I'd recommend is Sisley Berry's. Obviously, they need to read Find Your Voice as well. But Sisley Berry she died last year, very sadly. She really created voice coaching as a field for theatre voice. And any of her books, if people just go online and Google Sisley Berry, just read all her books, because she was absolutely brilliant. The way she writes about the voice just brings it alive. Gosh, in terms of albums, where do you start? I don't know. I think, who do I love? I'm into Fleetwood Mac at the moment. I don't know why. Having a 70s moment. I just love the freedom and the energy and the kind of the enjoyment of Fleetwood Mac. So I would point people to them at the moment in a very interesting way.
That's a band that went through a lot of changes over the years, from being a kind of blues band when they started to going through this metamorphosis to being then the kind of power pop stuff that they got known for later on. So they went through a lot of different changes, that group.
And Stevie Nicks' voice is awesome. Yeah. So yes, that's what I'm listening to at the moment. It's a COVID thing.
Fantastic. And let's imagine you woke up tomorrow morning and you have to start from scratch. So you've got all the tools you got trained, all the knowledge that you've acquired over the years, but no one knows you and you know no one. What would you do? How would you restart things?
Oh, wow. I would trust that you find your passion, you find the thing you love, you get good at it, and then you go out and you find the people who love it too. And as long as you have passion, discipline, and an ability to connect to people who love what you do, you'll always be okay, because you'll find your tribe.
So after hearing all this, where is the best place for people to go to learn more about you, the work you do, the coaching work you do, and also to get their copy of Find Your Voice?
So CarolineGoyder.com is my site, and Find Your Voice is available at all good online bookstores and hopefully real bookstores when we get back to real life. And if people buy the book and send a receipt to us at Caroline@CarolineGoyder.com, then we will send them a free set of audio courses, which is a lovely present for anybody who buys the book.
Beautiful. Well, we're going to have all of those links here. Caroline, thank you so much for coming on today onto the show and sharing all about your creative life. And I wish you lots of health and happiness.
My total pleasure. It's been lovely to chat. Great questions. Thank you.
If you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.